I am going to talk a little to you about LIDAR techniques for environmental and ecological monitoring. LIDAR stands for light detection and ranging, and it's actually a speciality at your own university through the great work of Professor Alexandros Papagiannis. Alexandros is a real important scientist in the field of LIDAR, and we had some early connections, and actually 3 years ago I was very surprised and enchanted by knowing that I've been nominated to become an honorary doctor at your university, and this is from this happy occasion closely before Christmas 3 years ago, where you can also see Professor Alexandros Papagiannis and me in front of maybe the world's most famous monument, the Acropolis. I've been working at Lund University here for more than 40 years, but during the last about 10 years or so, I also had a part-time position at South China Normal University in Guangzhou. That is what was called Canton earlier. There we built up an interdisciplinary research group together with Professor Katarina Svanberg, who actually also incidentally happens to be my wife since 53 years. So you have some time to go there for that. Okay, we had an interdisciplinary group over, and it dealt with environment, ecology, and agriculture, things that I will discuss here, but also food safety and biomedicine. And you might say these are very many different things, but as a matter of fact, for me as a spectroscopist and a physicist, it's all the same thing. The only thing that differs is the size of the optics, sort of. Here to the left in the environmental monitoring, we have big lasers and big telescopes to receive signals. Through ecology, it can be slightly smaller. Agriculture, we do basically similar things, but look for fluorescence instead of elastic backscattering. From agriculture comes all the food, and there is a lot of food packaging and issues about food safety. You can study that by spectroscopy. And when the food enters the body, that's good for human life. We enter the field of biomedicine. And the techniques of laser spectroscopy have also very many and very powerful applications in diagnostics and treatment of diseases. So we have covered all that, but I will here cover mostly LIDAR aspects. The close relation between these fields can be illustrated maybe in this picture done from our work here in Lund. If you look at the bottom here, you can see there is a laser being sent, say, over a city, few kilometers. It might be over Athens, if you like. And you see how much light comes back. By tuning the laser, you can see the average concentration of the air pollutants. But you might also send in the light through the forehead of a patient. Actually, this happens to be me, an MRI picture of that. If you send in the light, it will pass the air in the sinus cavity, bounce off the brain, and come out, and you can measure the concentration of oxygen. So from my point of view, these two projects are the same. Or here, where we have by a laser radar system fired ultraviolet pulses at the gate of the Lund Cathedral. This is a big area, 8 by 8 meters, and by fluorescence, laser-induced fluorescence, analyze different aspects of these surfaces. But you can do the same thing by instead sending the laser light close to the ear of a patient, induce fluorescence, and show instead different areas with different characteristics. This happens to be cancer, unfortunately. That just shows the close relation between these things. But now let's go to air pollution. That's a problem which plaguing the whole world, more or less. We have our share here in Sweden, You have for sure your share in Athens, I know. And this picture happens to be from Houston in Texas, where I got this interesting picture from my old friend Frank Tittel. This looks pretty nice, but you know, frequently it looks like this. And that's not so nice. So here it's nice if you can send out laser beam and map out the distribution of different pollutants. And that's exactly what can be done by laser radar techniques. You transmit pulses into the atmosphere, light is backscattered from particles and major molecules. If you tune the laser by a tunable laser onto an absorption line of a particular pollutant, which is here, you will get an absorption from that. And you compare that to the signal if you put yourself next to that absorption. In that way, you can make multispectral images like here. This is distribution of mercury atoms around a chemical factory. It happens to be Italy in this phase. And you can see where the mercury is, 300 meters away, also some distance up in the air. Or we can transmit laser light from a ship vertically. Here we pass under the plume of Mount Etna, the largest volcano in Europe. And there we can map out the layer of sulfur dioxide by looking at the difference if you sit on the absorption line of sulfur dioxide or off it. If you look for this difference, you can make these type of maps. This we pursued also based on 40 years of experience in laser radar. We also did that in our newer group in China. We stopped there now a year ago or so about, but this is the system we built there, a mobile system with the lasers on board. We transmit the laser pulses up over the mirror, out into the atmosphere. Light comes back via this mirror into the vertically looking telescope, and we record the signal, time resolved over there. And as always, the most important thing is not the equipment. The most important thing are the clever students. That's always true everywhere. This bus could be also docked to the fixed laboratory, which is practically just walk in here, and then the thing can go out anywhere into the field. Now this is actually in a quite polluted area of China, Guizhou, where are a lot of mines. So this is from a mercury mine. And here we map out in this area the concentration of mercury. Mercury is a bad pollutant, as you know, never toxic agent, and it comes from natural sources, anthropogenic sources, but and also from anthropogenic sources. It should be about 2 nanogram per cubic meter. Here, unfortunately, it's about 100 times more. So that's polluting. You can look at laser radars for pollutants, but you can also do interesting geophysical tracer work, as illustrated in this picture. This is the tomb of the Terracotta Army Emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi. And, the important thing is not his army. The important thing is his mausoleum, which was never opened. And according to tradition, it should be a lot of mercury in here. And it has high vapor pressure, so we thought maybe mercury would be coming up through cracks through the rock up here. And then there should be a halo of mercury laying on top of that. And lo and behold, on top of this pyramid, you see the increased concentration of mercury. So these old, more than 2,000 old stories from China was basically true, we believe. He lived at the same time as Alexander the Great, where you have a relation in Greece, of course. But interestingly, this type of pulse laser radar, it can be scaled down to much smaller distances. Here you can see we take a very short pulse laser and then we fire that into a pharmaceutical tablet. It's only 3 millimeters long, and it's like a little small cumulus cloud. And now, of course, on this small scale, we need a very high resolution, time resolution of the system. So you can see here when the light passes through and also scatters inside, it's delayed. It's delayed by 1 nanosecond or so. So it looks like nanosecond, that means about 30 centimeters of travel time. So the light rattles around inside the 3 millimeter tablet for 30 centimeters, which is an interesting aspect, certainly. So we can do a lot of things on all scales, which just illustrate my main argument about the importance of interdisciplinary work. We worked a lot with pharmaceutical industry and look at things like this by basically laser radar techniques. Not only pollutants in the air can be studied, you can also look at pollutants in water, and you can also study vegetation. How would you do that? Basically, you again transmit pulses, now ultraviolet pulses, into the environment. For instance, we direct it here into the liquid water. This is in Italy, it's the Arno River running through Florence, very famous. And if you do that, you can induce fluorescence. So what is fluorescence? Well, that's basically, if you say it's the discotheque effect. If you have a white shirt and you have ultraviolet lamps coming down, it's all is shining in bluish color by fluorescence. You also have invisible scripture on bills and on passports and so on. There you can see interesting markings for anti-forging activities. So fluorescence tells you here about the quality of the water. This is the algae in the water, the spectral signature from chlorophyll, and the signal over here is general pollution like detergents and so on. If you instead direct the beam onto the leaves of a tree, you see very strong signals due to chlorophyll. It's basically the same thing as you see here from the microscopic algae. And by looking at these two different signals here, the ratio between them tells you something about the concentration of chlorophyll, the health of the tree. We did a lot of that. Also in China, in agriculture, you can see here our system, how we fire here on the leaves of maize, corn, and get the spectral signatures. You can distinguish different types of species, how much you have put on the material to make it grow better, fertilizers, and so on. These things are expensive and very heavy. So it's nice if you can make it smaller. We did in China, and here we made an installation with a very cheap blue laser on a drone. And this is flying over the Pearl River next to our laboratory. Pearl River is, they have very poetic names over in China. And you can see here how the beam is inducing fluorescence on the water. And we flew like this here and also made samples of oil and different things. And so huge, beautiful signals with an extremely cheap system. That's of course much cheaper than flying around with a helicopter or anything like that. Okay, I will now switch over to the last part of my talk, and that is to tell you something about how laser radar techniques, LIDAR techniques, can be used also in ecology. Monitoring insects, for instance. Why are we interested in insects? Because they are pollinators, very important. If we don't have pollination, there's very little to eat, as you know. There are disease vectors like malaria carrying mosquitoes, extremely dangerous. And we have all these agricultural pests that eat a lot of the food that a starving world would be needing. So there are many reasons. And in laser radar, you can monitor even small particles in the air, aerosol particles in the air. So of course, then you can also monitor big particles in the air. They're called insects. So we realized that, and you know, it's quite interesting. And starting by that, we took the normal Swedish laser radar system, firing into a mirror, folding it, and let the beam fly half a meter over the surface of this little river. And every time one of these guys here sitting, resting here now on a leaf on the river, when they fly into the beam, we get a blip on the computer screen, which the coffee drinking students here could identify in a distance. This is called remote sensing. And this is illustrated here in this picture made by a former student, Mikkel Brydegård, where you see we fire the laser, the pulse flies out, it hits the insect, it induces fluorescence, now in different colors, it goes into the system, it's divided into 3 different detectors, and we record the signal. So this is laser radars. You can see the echo comes, it's 80 meters away. And then we have echoes in different colors. And that means we have basically a fingerprint, a little passport that each insect has to show to us there. It can be used for identification. There is a method which is much more efficient and much more cheap. That's seldom that is the case, that something is more efficient and more cheap. But that's the good news. That was an idea first come up with Mikkel Brydegård also, and that is to use a CW laser, not expensive pulse laser. This is a Chinese 1 watt laser, basically. It might cost $100 or $200 or so, and it's expanded and sent out into the atmosphere all the time. Then we have a telescope down here. It's a cheap astronomical tube, basically, which now looks at the beam at different distances and images the beam. So this is sort of a triangulation. So you get the distance by trigonometry. And this is from a field experiment in China, over 0.5 kilometer about, and we send out the beams over there and see the blips on the detector when the insects fly into the beam. And this is from this field experiment, and we can see how many insects fly into the beam as a function of time, 24 hours. This is the morning in China. This is the evening in China. And you can see here in the evening, they start to fly a lot. And we can look at different size of insects, small insects, big insects. We can see the bats who try to catch them and so on. And we can see how the bats themselves try to avoid their predators, hawks and so on. A lot of information. We could also transfer that into water. And that is much shorter ranges. We send the beam through the water. We observe the laser beam from the side and image the laser beam from the side onto an array detector. Then we can get good resolution at close range and not so good resolution further away. And you can see here on the recorder, we see the different structures in the water. Now it's only 5 or 10 meters and not kilometers range, but it basically works the same way. This is a recent paper from our group in China. As you can see here, lots of Chinese names here. Several of them ended up in the US as PhD students. You can also see here how we release living shrimps in the water, in the tank. And then we could see how they moved their legs. And how they move their legs, that tells you something about what type of animal is there. You see the echoes in real time. It's like a film. Like for the insects, we can see the frequency at which the insects flap their wings and doing Fourier transformation and see that. That is also a fingerprint, how you can identify different types of insects like that. Again, can you do it more cheaply? Yes. You can also put such a system, an imaging system, on a drone. It lifted, in this case, 3 kilograms. The laser beam goes down, and we image the laser beam from the side with a small telescope coupled to a spectrometer. And you can see here how we can see the echoes from the top of the tree and the bottom here, and we also see the 2 peaked fluorescence from chlorophyll. So we have mapped out 2 trees growing outside our laboratory when we were flying back and forth under GPS control. The very best thing about this is, of course, that it's realistic and cheap, and that meant that it's also applied at places where there are not very many resources, like in Africa. And for quite a number of years, we try to help by making small workshops there. And here you can see how these type of systems were set up in Nairobi. We had many of the systems had in groups from different very poor countries like Ivory Coast, Ghana, Burkina Faso, Kenya, Senegal, what have you. So each of these setups costs not much more than 10,000 US dollars. Amazing, because we use, you know, cheap astronomical telescopes, which you can buy if you are interested in astronomy, and you buy cheap lasers, and again an astronomical amateur astronomy tube over here, and of course computers are cheap. So here again we could do a lot of things. So this is done at many places in Africa, and that's a particularly nice aspect of this, if you can be of any help to those who have very little. That comes to my final picture here, where I would like to thank you for your attention, and also thank, of course, all students and collaborators I had through all these years of pursuing science. And I would like to put it all to a certain perspective. We live on the blue planet, the home of all mankind. And this is how the Apollo astronauts would see it. Interestingly, this picture here is taken by the Cassini spacecraft when that's close to Saturn. You see the rings of Saturn. And when that telescope looks back in this direction into deep space, it sees a little blue spot. What is that? That's we. This is the Earth seen from Saturn. And, you know, we have this little thing around a star among the billions of stars in our own galaxy. And there are billions of galaxies around. So we are all sitting here on spaceship Earth. And then we ask ourselves, why are we making so much trouble for each other? We are on the same spaceship, we share the whole world. And it's science and friendship who should do something about this to shape a better world. So it's you who has to take up the task to do it all, stimulate by enthusiasm and being full of endurance to change the world. Thank you very much. Yes, surely. That's not very complicated. Of course, if you have such a small, you might know that in laser radar, if you want to have a high spatial resolution, you must use sufficiently short pulses. Normally there we use pulses which are, say, 10 nanosecond long. So sending out a pulse in laser radar in the atmosphere, that means that we send out a package which is about 3 meters long, 30 centimeter in 1 nanosecond, 10 nanoseconds is 3 meters. And then we send out a package which travels with the velocity of light and scatters back. Then we can measure distances and things on a meter precision also with our detection system. If you want to look at small things like a tablet, that's of course much smaller. We don't deal with kilometers, we deal with millimeter. Then the pulse length must be very short. So we send out picosecond pulses, and they can be generated from a rather cheap light emitting diode or from a pulsed LED. So that is what you use. And then you can use, of course, time resolving electronics, which is sufficiently fast. and buy single photon cartons. You can buy cards and put that into your computer and so on. So it does not need to have a very high cost. So, you know, you have to match the laser and the detection system to the resolution you need. Small things need a very high resolution. Larger things, it's not so important. So, yes, of course, the gas clouds, of course, we have around factories, there are a lot of gas clouds. There was even a little gas cloud around the Terracotta Army tomb, as you saw there. So we can do that. You know, in the world which is full of wars and stuff, there you can ask yourself, can you monitor dangerous gases that let out? Sure, you can do that also. I tried to keep out of anything military because, you know, I think there is too much of these things in the world. But, you know, many of these techniques are used a lot by militaries to monitor, for instance, gas clouds and things like that. Going further out, of course, in space, in principle, you can monitor, of course, everything we knew about universe, about the gases, interstellar gas, comes from spectroscopy. We see there, and now the big challenge is to look at exoplanets. You know, there are thousands of planets detected around other suns. And now people are trying very hard to see the gases which are in the atmosphere. Would it be possible to live there and so on? So that's really connects to what you say to outer space. I would say with LIDAR is of course difficult to do because you have to wait quite a long time till the signal comes back and so on. So you might need a few generations of NTUA students to analyze the data when you send it out. But jokingly, but it's interesting that, you know, out in outer space, in these clouds, there are both masers, microwave emission stimulated, and lasers, because these gases can be pumped by star radiation. So there might be glimpses of laser light coming from deep space, which we don't use for pollution monitor or anything like that. That's a very interesting. In passing, there is the other thing about, you know, is there anybody out there except us? It's a search for extra terrestrial intelligence, where people have been looking with radio telescopes, and people have started actually also to look for glimpses of laser light possibly coming in as a message. But, you know, it takes time to answer.